February 24th, 1603, Richmond Palace. A dying woman whispers a confession that will shatter the most powerful monarch in Europe. Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, clutches the hand of her queen, a woman she served for 45 years. With her last breaths, she reveals a secret that she's carried for 2 years. A ring, a message of peace from the Earl of Essex, intercepted and hidden. A chance for mercy that Elizabeth never knew existed. The Queen's reaction is visceral. She strikes the dying woman, screaming that God may forgive her, but she never will. This moment marks the beginning of the end, not just of a reign that transformed England, but of a woman whose final days would be so horrific, so undignified, that those who witnessed them could barely bring themselves to record what they saw. What happened to Elizabeth I in those last weeks of her life reads like a Gothic horror story. A woman who spent 45 years in absolute control would die standing up, refusing to lie down for 4 straight days. A queen whose face was so thick with toxic lead paint that it cracked under the embalmer's touch. A body so deteriorated that it would literally explode in its coffin during the funeral procession. This is the story of how the Virgin Queen, the woman who defeated the Spanish Armada, who turned England into a world power, spent her final days in a nightmare of her own making. By February 1603, Elizabeth was already fragile. At 69 years old, she'd outlived almost everyone she'd ever trusted. But Catherine Howard's deathbed confession wasn't just another loss. It was the revelation that destroyed her. The French ambassador reported that after Catherine's death, Elizabeth fell into what he called deep melancholy, with conceit of her own death. She began complaining of sudden infirmities that seemed to appear from nowhere. Her ladies noticed she would sit for hours, staring at nothing, occasionally breaking into tears. But it wasn't just Catherine's betrayal that haunted her. As her body weakened, the ghosts of her past came flooding back. Sir Robert Carey, who was present during these final weeks, witnessed something extraordinary. The Queen, racked with guilt over decisions made decades earlier, began crying about Mary, Queen of Scots. 16 years had passed since Mary's execution. 16 years. Yet here was Elizabeth weeping and, according to Carey, manifesting her innocence, that she never gave consent to the death of that queen. The guilt she'd suppressed for so long was now consuming her, and Mary wasn't the only ghost. Elizabeth became fixated on Catherine Grey, another woman with royal blood whom Elizabeth had imprisoned until she died. Catherine's grandson, Edward Seymour, was now circling like a vulture, waiting for Elizabeth to die so he could claim her throne. The irony wasn't lost on the dying queen. While Elizabeth's mind crumbled, her body staged its own revolt, and the physical deterioration was nothing short of nightmarish. By January, what started as a simple cold had evolved into something far worse. Contemporary sources describe what they called a defluxion in the throat, what modern pathologists now believe was quinsy, a peritonsillar abscess. Imagine your throat swelling shut from the inside, filled with pus, making every swallow feel like broken glass. The Venetian ambassador reported that her throat showed infected glands like almonds, swollen, painful and oozing. But the throat infection was just the beginning. Elizabeth's teeth, what few remained, were black stumps of decay. Decades of sugar consumption, combined with the mercury treatments common at the time, had rotted them from the inside out. The dental abscesses were so severe that the infection spread to her neck glands. She couldn't eat. She could barely drink. The pain was constant, excruciating. Then came the discovery that horrified her courtiers. Her coronation ring, the symbol of her marriage to England, worn continuously for 45 years, had grown into her flesh. William Camden recorded the grotesque detail. The ring had so grown into her flesh that it could not be drawn off. Think about that. The ring had been there so long, through so much swelling and weight gain over the decades, that her finger had literally grown around it. They had to file through the gold while she watched, the metal embedded so deep in her swollen flesh that it left a permanent groove in the bone. The cutting of the ring wasn't just physically painful, it was symbolically devastating. Camden himself noted it was a sad presage, as if it portended that the marriage with her kingdom, contracted by the ring, would be dissolved. The quinsy in Elizabeth's throat was just one symptom of a body in total system failure. Dr. Lister, one of Elizabeth's physicians, later described symptoms he was too frightened to record while she lived. Her urine had turned dark brown, a sign of kidney failure, likely from decades of mercury and lead poisoning. Her legs were so swollen with edema that her shoes had to be cut off. The swelling extended up to her abdomen, making breathing difficult, and she developed what appears to have been pneumonia in her final week. Witnesses described her breathing as rattling, with periodic coughing fits that brought up blood-tinged sputum. The combination of the throat infection, pneumonia, and fluid in her lungs meant she was essentially drowning in her own body fluids. But perhaps most disturbing were the neurological symptoms. Beyond the memory loss and confusion, Elizabeth began experiencing what her ladies described as fits. She would suddenly go rigid, her eyes rolling back, her body trembling. Modern physicians reviewing the accounts suggest these were likely seizures caused by the lead poisoning reaching critical levels in her brain. The royal physicians tried everything. They attempted to bleed her, but she refused. They prepared poultices of horse dung and wine, the standard treatment for throat infections, but she wouldn't let them near her. Dr. Lister wrote that she would not suffer any physical medicine, convinced that the doctors themselves were trying to poison her. In desperation, they tried to feed her cordial broths through a tube, but her throat was so swollen and painful that even this was impossible. For the last 3 days of her life, she consumed nothing but a few spoonfuls of sugared water. But perhaps the most insidious killer was something Elizabeth applied to herself every single day: her makeup. For over 40 years, Elizabeth had painted her face with Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. Every morning, layers upon layers of this toxic paste were applied to hide the scars from her smallpox, to maintain the illusion of eternal youth. The lead seeped through her skin, accumulating in her body, slowly poisoning her from the outside in. By 1603, the symptoms were undeniable. Her hair had fallen out, not thinned but fallen out in clumps, leaving her nearly bald. She wore increasingly elaborate wigs to hide it. Her memory, once sharp enough to speak 6 languages fluently, began to fail. She would forget names, lose track of conversations mid-sentence. Modern toxicologists studying historical accounts have identified classic signs of chronic lead poisoning: the hair loss, the cognitive decline, the muscle weakness, the abdominal pain she frequently complained of. Some historians even suggest the lead poisoning contributed to her psychological breakdown. Hallucinations and paranoia are common in advanced cases. The makeup that had protected her image for decades had become her slow executioner. And the cruel irony: the more the lead damaged her skin, the more makeup she needed to hide the damage. A vicious toxic cycle that only ended with death. The Venetian ceruse was just the beginning of Elizabeth's toxic beauty regime. To achieve the blood-red lips that feature in every portrait, she used vermilion, mercuric sulfide. Mercury, absorbed through the delicate skin of the lips, causes neurological damage, kidney failure, and what physicians of the time called the shakes. Elizabeth's handwriting in her final years shows a telltale tremor that wasn't there in her youth. For her eyes, she used belladonna drops to dilate her pupils. The fashion of the time demanded large, dark eyes. Belladonna is literally translated as beautiful woman, but its other name tells the real story: deadly nightshade. Regular use causes hallucinations, confusion, and vision problems. By 1603, Elizabeth could barely see. She had to have state papers read aloud to her. To remove the lead makeup each night, she used a mixture of eggshells, alum, and mercury. Then in the morning, before applying fresh lead, she would first paint her face with egg whites to create a smooth base. Layer upon layer, day after day, year after year. One courtier who saw her without makeup in 1602 was so shocked, he wrote that her face looked like parchment, with great wrinkles. The skin was so damaged that when she smiled, the makeup would crack along the lines, requiring constant touch-ups throughout the day. Ladies-in-waiting were tasked with following her with pots of fresh ceruse to fill in the cracks as they appeared. But nothing was more bizarre than what happened in early March 1603. Elizabeth developed an irrational, absolute terror of lying down. She became convinced that if she went to bed, she would never rise again. This wasn't metaphorical. She literally refused to lie down. For 15 hours straight, she stood in her chambers. 15 hours. Her ladies watched in horror as their 69-year-old queen, sick and dying, stood motionless like a statue. When her legs finally gave out, she didn't go to bed. She collapsed onto cushions that her ladies had spread on the floor, and there she stayed. For 4 consecutive days and nights, Elizabeth sat on those cushions. She didn't speak. She refused all food. She refused all drink. She refused all medical treatment. Robert Carey described the scene. She sat with her finger in her mouth in complete silence, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her courtiers were beside themselves. Here was the Queen of England sitting on floor cushions like a stubborn child, apparently willing herself to die rather than admit weakness by lying in a bed. The Secretary of State, Robert Cecil, tried to reason with her. When he suggested she must go to bed, Elizabeth snapped back with one of her last coherent statements. Must is not a word to use to princes. Finally, Charles Howard, the Earl of Nottingham, and her Lord Admiral had seen enough. On March 21st, he physically forced her to bed. Robert Carey's account is telling. What by fair means, what by force, he got her to bed. They had to physically carry the Queen of England to her bed, and once there, she never rose again. During those 4 days when Elizabeth sat on her cushions refusing to move, a careful watch was organised around her. Her ladies-in-waiting took shifts, never leaving her alone for a moment. Lady Warwick later wrote that the Queen would occasionally reach out and grab whoever was nearest, holding their hand with surprising strength, then release them without a word. Sometimes she would motion for a specific lady to come closer, stare into their eyes intently, then dismiss them with a wave. The Countess of Nottingham, not to be confused with Catherine Howard, who had died in February, tried to feed her. She would kneel beside the Queen with a silver bowl of broth, begging her to eat. Elizabeth would turn her head away like a stubborn child. Once, when the Countess persisted, Elizabeth suddenly grabbed the bowl and threw it across the room, the only violent outburst during those silent days. At night, the watching became even more critical. Elizabeth had developed a terror of being alone in the dark. Dozens of candles were kept burning at all times. When she dozed, still sitting upright on her cushions, her ladies would hold their breath, wondering if this was finally the end. But then her eyes would snap open, wild and frightened, searching the room as if she'd forgotten where she was. Lady Scrope recorded that on the 3rd night, Elizabeth began pointing at the corner of the room, following something with her eyes that no one else could see. She would shake her head violently, as if arguing with an invisible presence. Some whispered she was seeing the devil come to collect her soul. Others, more pragmatically, recognised the hallucinations of lead poisoning and fever. March 23rd, 1603. Elizabeth lay dying and England held its breath. For 45 years she had refused to name an heir. It was her ultimate power play, keeping everyone guessing, everyone dependent on her favour. But now, with her voice gone and consciousness fading, the Privy Council faced a crisis. They gathered around her bed. Robert Cecil leaned close and began listing possible successors. When he mentioned James VI of Scotland, something happened. According to Robert Carey, Elizabeth put her hand to her head when the King of Scots was named to succeed her. The council interpreted this as her making the sign of a crown, her consent for James to inherit. But here's the problem. Other witnesses in that room claimed she made no gesture at all. Some said she was already unconscious. The crown gesture may have been a convenient fiction, political cover for a decision the council had already made. The ambiguity was perfect for Cecil, who had been secretly corresponding with James for years, preparing for this exact moment. Whether Elizabeth actually chose James, or whether her council chose for her remains one of history's mysteries. While Elizabeth lay dying, Richmond Palace became a snake pit of conspiracy and opportunism. Robert Cecil wasn't the only one playing the succession game. The Earl of Northumberland had been stockpiling weapons. Lord Cobham was gathering supporters for Arbella Stuart's claim. Catholic nobles were meeting in secret, hoping against hope that Elizabeth's death might restore the old religion. But Cecil was 10 steps ahead of them all. He'd been corresponding with James VI of Scotland since 1601, using a cipher code and secret messengers. Every letter was a delicate dance. Cecil couldn't openly betray his dying queen, but he needed to secure his position with her successor. On March 19th, as Elizabeth's condition worsened, Cecil took a calculated risk. He drafted a proclamation declaring James as king, dated it for the future, and had it ready to distribute the moment Elizabeth died. He stationed riders at every major road out of London. He placed guards at every port to prevent any rival claimant from escaping to raise foreign support. The dying queen, semi-conscious on her cushions, had no idea that her Secretary of State had already organised her successor's government. James already knew which English nobles would be in his Privy Council, who would be arrested, who would be rewarded. The transition was choreographed down to the minute. Sir Robert Carey, meanwhile, had his own agenda. He'd prepared 3 horses along the road to Scotland, stationed at strategic points. His sister, Lady Scrope, was at Elizabeth's bedside not out of loyalty, but to ensure she could grab the sapphire ring the moment the Queen died. They'd planned this for weeks. Carey would later boast that he made the 400-mile journey to Edinburgh in less than 3 days, a record that would stand for decades. That evening, Archbishop John Whitgift was summoned. The 73-year-old Archbishop found Elizabeth barely conscious, lying on her back, one hand under the covers, one exposed. What followed was extraordinary. Whitgift began to pray. He prayed for so long that his old knees grew weary and he tried to leave. But Elizabeth, this woman who hadn't spoken in days, somehow made a sign for him to continue. He prayed for another half hour, what witnesses called earnest cries to God for her soul's health, which he uttered with that fervency of spirit as the Queen, to all our sight, much rejoiced thereat. She fell into a deep sleep. Between 2 and 3 a.m. on March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor died. The witnesses described it poetically, mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from the tree. The Virgin Queen was dead, but her body's final horror was yet to come. The moment Elizabeth died at 3 a.m. on March 24th, the machinery of succession kicked into motion with almost unseemly haste. Lady Scrope didn't even wait for the body to grow cold. She wrenched the sapphire ring from Elizabeth's finger, the flesh was still warm, and dropped it from a window to her brother Robert Carey waiting below. He was in the saddle and galloping north before the death bells rang. Carey's ride to Scotland was legendary in its ambition and execution. The first horse was waiting at Doncaster. He rode it so hard that it collapsed just past York. The second horse got him to the Scottish border, where he fell during a river crossing and was kicked in the head, opening a bloody gash. Local border raiders, seeing a wealthy Englishman alone and injured, tried to rob him. He fought them off and continued riding. He reached Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh on the evening of March 26th, covering nearly 400 miles in just 60 hours. When he arrived, caked in mud and blood, King James was already in bed. Carey insisted on being admitted immediately. He knelt by the king's bedside and hailed him as King of England, presenting the sapphire ring as proof. James, who had been waiting for this moment for years, played it cool. He questioned Carey closely about the circumstances of Elizabeth's death, the mood in London, the disposition of the English nobles. Only when satisfied did he reward Carey with a position as a gentleman of the bedchamber, though Cecil would later reduce this reward, angry that Carey had acted without official sanction. Elizabeth had been explicit. She did not want to be disemboweled after death. The idea of her body being cut open, her organs removed, horrified her. She gave clear instructions that this was not to happen. Robert Cecil ignored her wishes completely. Her internal organs were removed, her body was embalmed, and she was sealed in a lead-lined coffin. For over a month, her body lay in state while funeral preparations were made. Then, during the funeral procession to Westminster Abbey on April 28th, it happened. Attendants heard a loud crack from inside the coffin. The decomposition gases that had built up inside the sealed lead coffin had nowhere to go. The pressure built and built until finally, the body exploded. Some accounts describe it as sounding like a cannon shot. The putrefaction had literally burst the corpse open inside its metal prison. The attendants, horrified, continued the procession. What else could they do? They carried a coffin containing the exploded remains of England's greatest queen through the streets of London while thousands of mourners wept, completely unaware of the grotesque reality inside the lead box. The funeral on April 28th was a production worthy of Hollywood, masking the horror of what lay in the coffin. Over 1,600 official mourners processed through London. The streets were draped in black cloth. Every church bell in the city tolled in unison. The procession stretched for over a mile, taking 4 hours to pass any given point. The coffin itself was a masterpiece of deception. Covered in purple velvet and cloth of gold, it bore the crown, orb, and sceptre. But the real genius was the effigy on top. Modelled by Maximilian Colt, it was so lifelike that people gasped when they saw it. The face was painted with the same white lead Elizabeth had worn in life. The red hair, which Elizabeth had lost years ago, was a wig made from silk. The hands, carved in wood, wore exact replicas of her rings. The effigy wore a crimson velvet robe with an ermine collar, the same one Elizabeth had worn to her last parliament. Every detail was perfect, down to the jewelled buttons. It was Elizabeth as she wanted to be remembered, not the bald, toothless, lead-poisoned creature who had actually died. John Stowe the chronicler recorded that when the procession reached Westminster, there was such a general sighing, groaning and weeping as the like hath not been seen or known in the memory of man. But he also noted something strange. Many of the tears seemed forced. The professional mourners, paid to wail and beat their breasts, were going through the motions. Behind the pageantry there was relief. The old Queen was dead. The succession had passed peacefully. England had a king again, a king with a wife and children, ensuring the succession for another generation. Some courtiers could barely contain their excitement about the new reign. When embalmers had prepared Elizabeth's body, they found a woman unrecognisable from her portraits. The white lead makeup was so thick it had formed a cracked shell over her face. When they tried to clean it, it came off in sheets, revealing damaged, discoloured skin beneath. Most of her hair was gone. Her teeth were black stumps or missing entirely. This was the reality beneath the illusion. The Virgin Queen revealed as a poisoned, deteriorated shell of her former self. She was initially interred in her grandfather Henry VII's vault, but even in death, Elizabeth couldn't rest. In 1606, James I had her moved to share a tomb with her half-sister Mary I, the very sister Elizabeth had lived in terror of, the Catholic queen whose throne Elizabeth had taken. The inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in the hope of resurrection." The irony would have infuriated Elizabeth. After a lifetime of keeping Mary's memory suppressed, she now shares eternity with her. In the days immediately following Elizabeth's death, Richmond Palace became a monument to absence. Her private chambers were sealed on Cecil's orders, but servants later reported strange incidents. The Queen's favourite little dog, a spaniel, refused to leave her room. It sat by her empty bed, howling mournfully for days until someone finally removed it by force. It died within a week, having refused all food. Her collection of over 3,000 dresses was catalogued for distribution. Each gown was a work of art: cloth of gold, silver tissue, velvets embroidered with pearls and gems. But when the wardrobe mistresses opened them, they found many were rotting from the inside out. The lead from her makeup had transferred to the fabric, eating through silk and velvet like acid. Dresses worth fortunes crumbled at a touch. Her cosmetics table was left exactly as it was the morning she died. Pots of ceruse, half used, the vermilion for her lips, the belladonna drops, the tools of her transformation, brushes, sponges, cloths stained white with lead. Cecil ordered everything burned, but not before one courtier recorded that the smell from the cosmetics was most foul and pestilent. The throne room at Richmond stood empty for 3 days after her death, no one quite sure what to do with it. Should they wait for James? Should they remove Elizabeth's coat of arms? In the end, it was decided to leave everything exactly as it was until the new king arrived. When James finally entered the throne room in May, he reportedly recoiled at Elizabeth's portrait hanging behind the throne. He ordered it removed immediately and replaced with his own. The greatest queen in English history was already being erased, her image packed away into storage like the woman herself had been packed into lead and buried. Elizabeth I's death was a masterclass in the price of absolute power. Every decision she'd made to maintain control, the toxic makeup, the refusal to name an heir, the isolation from human affection, came back to destroy her in the end. The lead that gave her the face of a queen slowly poisoned her mind and body. Her refusal to show weakness left her dying on floor cushions, too proud to lie in a bed. The bodies she'd ordered broken, Mary Queen of Scots, Catherine Grey, haunted her final consciousness with guilt that 16 years couldn't erase. She died as she had lived, alone, defiant and desperately trying to control an image that had already cracked beyond repair. The explosion of her corpse in its coffin feels almost metaphorical. the final violent rejection of the imprisonment she'd placed on herself. Elizabeth gave everything to be queen. In the end, that crown cost her everything that makes us human. She died not as a woman, but as a grotesque monument to her own power, painted, poisoned, and ultimately, alone. The Virgin Queen got her wish. She remained married only to England. But England, like all kingdoms, is a cold bedfellow in the dark hours before dawn, when even queens must face their mortality with nothing but their ghosts for company.